We just wanted to take a moment before we actually get into the meat of the program to really center ourselves on the why we're here. Why are we here in terms of this webinar, but why are we here in terms of the measures that we are about to, share with you, like what brought these measures. And as many of you remember, in 2022, LA City Council audio leak scandal that came out shook the core of our community's trust in our local government and our democracy as a whole. The abhorrent racism on display in these tapes grabbed the headlines, but we cannot forget the context of those conversations. The elected officials involved were discussing the plans for the redistricting process that they later executed, where they carved up the city to enrich their districts and advance their political opportunities while undermining their opponents and reducing Black political power. So while this scandal will forever mar their political careers, none of this was illegal or outside their authority as council members. This is why we need DD and LL to create an independent process for redistricting within LA City and LAUSD to ensure this abuse of power can never happen again. In this election, we all need to vote with our values and vote up the whole ballot, especially local measures such as measures D, D, and LL. Local measures end up having the most direct impact on our everyday lives. So let's get started.
For today's agenda, we're going to provide a brief introduction to the Angelenos for Fair Maps Yes on Measures DDNLL campaign and campaign committee. We'll explain a little bit what redistricting is and an overview of how redistricting works. And then we're going to join into a conversation with our guest speaker, Councilmember Nithya Raman, to share stories and hopes for redistricting in Los Angeles in the future. We're going to explain why we would urge you to vote yes on DD and LL and what your role can be in helping us win these critical measures. Finally, we'll start to close out with some questions and answers and a call to action, and we'll close. We should be able to get this all done within the hour, and we're really excited to be here with you. I will pass it on to my colleague, Carolina.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for being here. My name is Carolina Goodman. My pronouns are she, her. I'm the chair of the Committee on Government Reform for the League of Women Voters of Greater Los Angeles. The Angelenos for Fair Maps, Yes on Measures DD and LL campaign is made up of diverse government reform, community-based, and civil rights organizations, as well as individuals who are committed to the creation of fair district maps. We believe that residents in the city of Los Angeles and within Los Angeles Unified School District boundaries must have the ability to elect representatives who prioritize the needs and concerns of their constituents. In the past redistricting cycle, coalition members worked closely with communities in Los Angeles to push for fair and transparent processes. The campaign seeks to make a special effort to contact voters with low turnout rates, in particular, young voters and diverse community groups in all geographic areas of Los Angeles. We provide education about government reform, what an independent redistricting commission, IRC, is, and why you need to vote for it. Measures DD and LL would, in short, next slide, create independent redistricting policies and procedures that would prevent elected officials from choosing their own voters. Rather than being appointed, commissioners will be selected through an open application process overseen by the Ethics Commission Commissioners will be able to make decisions based on their own research and valuable input from residents. Measures DD and LL are designed to give decision-making power to the people, not politicians. Rules are in place to ensure transparency and accountability. We will be covering more about what the measures are and how they result in fair district maps. But first, let's go deeper on what an IRC is and why it matters. I'm passing it over to my colleague, Julia Gomez.
Hi, everyone. My name is Julia Gomez. It's so nice to be here. I am a staff attorney at the ACLU of Southern California, and my pronouns are she, her. I'll be going over what redistricting is and why it matters, just to highlight why Measures DD, which covers the City of LA redistricting process, and Measure LL, which covers LAUSD, are so important. Next slide, please. So, as folks may know, the LA City Council is governed by the governing body for the city of Los Angeles. It makes really important decisions for our everyday lives. It sets the city budget, it imposes taxes, it makes public improvements, and it sets local regulations. LAUSD Board of Education similarly has a great impact, not just on students' lives, but on their families and the communities that the BOE serves. The BOE represents all students, it allocates resources, it engages communities, and it evaluates officers such as the superintendent. So fair elections are really important to ensure that our representatives continue to listen to us, and fair elections start with fair district maps. So what are fair district maps and what is redistricting? Next slide, please. District maps divide voters into geographic areas, and the city council and BOE members are elected from these districts. The map on your screen is the map for the LA City Council that was adopted this last redistricting cycle. So voters who live in District 1, for example, elect an individual to represent them in the 15-member city council. In 2022, those voters elected Councilmember Eunices Hernandez in District 3. Redistricting is when we redraw district lines to ensure that each district has the same amount of residents. And this happens every 10 years. All right, and this happens every 10 years after we get an updated census population data that shows us whether or not districts have become uneven in population. This is why we had a redistricting process in 2021, and this is why we're going to have a redistricting process in 2031 following the 2030 census. As you can imagine, the way voters are grouped into districts has an enormous impact on who ends up on the city council and what policies they advocate for. So, for example, if a district is made up of mostly renters, you can imagine that they may vote for someone who represents or supports tenants' rights. So it matters how lines are drawn, and measures DD and LL provide line drawing guidelines that prioritize communities and not incumbents. The guidelines matter, but who draws the line also matters. Next slide, please. On one side of the spectrum, we have elected officials who historically have drawn the lines and continue to draw the lines for the vast majority of California localities. Advisory commissions are often also used by incumbents to help them draw the lines. These commissions are appointed by elected officials to lead the redistricting process, but these commissioners, unfortunately, are beholden to the interest of the incumbents that appoint them. Politicians have the final say, and they can decide whether to adopt, reject, or change the advisory commission recommendations. And then finally, we have the gold standard, which are independent redistricting commissions, and which measures DG and LL would establish for LA City and LAUSD. RCs are made up of residents that meet specific criteria and go through a public application process to make sure that they're truly independent. They're completely independent from any influence or interference by elected officials, and they have the final decision-making authority for adopting district maps. So what does LA City and LAUSD currently have? Currently, both jurisdictions have advisory commissions. And as we saw this last redistricting cycle, there were a number of problems with the advisory commissions. While they did receive public feedback and they presented final map recommendations to LAUSD BOE and LA City respectively, they're structured, as already noted, in a way that they're influenced by elected officials, and this makes it vulnerable to corruption and disenfranchisement. First, as we saw this last cycle, under the current system, conflicts remain because members are appointed by politicians, and they can and those commissioners can be removed at will by politicians for any reason. Commissioners are also not paid, and this means at the end of the day, they are there to serve their appointed authority and not residents of Los Angeles. Second, LA City and LAUSD commissions had a lack of transparency this last cycle about how they drew the lines and how they made decisions. Logs of Los Angeles City Commissioners' communications during the last cycle showed that commissioners were in constant contact with council members and their staff behind closed doors, and the tapes that we learned about also show that they were in contact with, other politicians and folks behind closed doors. Third, advisory commissioners have no decision-making authority. This past cycle, LA City elected officials completely disregarded the City Advisory Commission recommendations and instead set up a last-minute committee made up of council members to draw district lines. In doing that, the council disregarded months of community input received by the Advisory Commission. And finally, in the current system, politicians and political appointees may be incentivized to prioritize their own political future, political factions, special interests, or economic interests, like the fight over USC, to the detriment of communities. This means the adoption of maps result that don't adequately represent communities. Luckily, next slide, please. We have measures GG and LL, which would address all of these issues. Instead of appointed commissioners that can be removed at will by politicians, measures GG and LL would require an independent selection process. Applicants will need to meet eligibility criteria, and incumbents and political insiders cannot apply. Public meetings will also be held to select the final commissioners, and commissioners will receive compensation for their time, including reimbursement for childcare and transportation costs, and they'll have to answer to residents and not incumbents. Measures GG and LL will also prohibit commissioners from communicating with electeds, and the IRC will need to prepare a report at the end of the process to explain how map drawing decisions were made. Next slide, please. IRC commissioners will not have incentives to prioritize incumbents this time around. As noted at the outset, commissioners are screened to ensure their independence, and they must also follow strict line drawing criteria that requires them to prioritize keeping communities of interest together, that is, communities that share social or economic interests, and they are prohibited from considering incumbency. And most importantly, measures GG and LL will give final decision-making authority to commissioners. This means that the people, the commissioners who are taking in community testimony throughout the process and public meetings are the same people drawing and adopting the final lines. So now that folks have a better understanding of what redistricting is, why it matters, and how measures GG and LL differ from our current system, let's learn about the story from our guest speaker to paint a picture of their experiences and hopes with redistricting. I'll pass it over to Russia to get us going.
Thank you, Julia. I would like to introduce our special guest speaker, Councilmember Nithya Raman. Good evening, Councilmember Raman. We are so excited to have you join us and share with us your perspectives and experiences about how our current redistricting system impacts communities and how an IRC could improve the process. So let's dive in.
Okay, thank you for having me.
Oh, we're so happy to have you here. Councilmember Rahman, we know that the last redistricting cycle impacted you in a very direct way as an elected official. We also know that as a council member, you will be relinquishing decision-making power in the redistricting process if voters vote yes to establish independent redistricting commissions this November. What was your experience during the 2021 LA City redistricting process, and what motivated you to become a champion for having an IRC for the city of LA and LAUSD?
Great. Well, thank you guys so much for having me. I think this group, we've heard from you a lot through the independent redistricting process here at the city of Los Angeles. And your voices really shaped what's going to be on the ballot in November. So I just want to thank you all for your thought leadership and your partnership in moving this forward, and your diligence in following the work through a number of sometimes very long and obscure committee meetings, and sometimes some very long and sometimes even to me, felt kind of pointless discussions, but that's okay. That's fine. That's democracy at work. But I did want to, I wanted to share a little bit about what my experience of redistricting was. And, there were people became aware of how flawed the redistricting process was during the tapes, when the tapes leaked in 2022. But the advisory redistricting process that took place, that submitted their maps to the city, was already really problematic. I think there's sometimes a feeling like this sacrosanct map that represented very clearly the will of all of those hundreds of people who had given testimony. That map is what was sent to the council, and the council made those changes to it. And I think both maps were flawed. I think the map that came out of the redistricting commission was flawed, and I think the map that the council ultimately passed was flawed. Both were flawed, but they were flawed because it was a flawed process that invited meddling and that invited politicization of a process, which I think should not be ultimately politicized. It should be really one that's done in the interests of people. So for the advisory redistricting commission for LA City, some of the people who served on it were former elected officials who had a very big stake in who was in office currently and who would be in office in the future. There were registered lobbyists who served on that commission, who had business in front of the city, either currently or in the future. There were people who planned to run for office who were sitting on that commission and who had made their decision to run before they were appointed to that commission. And there were people whose family members were planning to run for office who also sat on that commission. The appointed commissioners were allowed to have conversations with the council members and other people at the city who appointed them. That was legal to do. You just had to tell people that you did that, and you had to describe in fairly top line ways the content of your conversation with the person who appointed you. And you could reappoint them at any point if you felt frustrated by the way in which your appointee was, representing your interests on that body, or if you felt like they weren't able to adequately represent your interests on that body. And so that commission was already a highly politicized space. And it felt very political and politicized to me as someone who I had just been elected in November of 2020. I started in earnest in January of 2021. I didn't know much about what redistricting was supposed to be like or how I was supposed to experience it. I really thought it was a hands-off process. And that was very, very different from what happened when we were going through that process. It was a very intensive and engaged process between the council, not everybody on the council, but between the council and some commissioners. And the decisions that were being made around what lines were being drawn where were very much lines that were connected to the incumbency of existing council members, or with an eye to who was going to be running for that district and how well they would be able to do in that district. And not on what I think is the most important thing that we should be thinking about, which is how can Angelenos elect the right people to represent them? And it was a very, very frustrating process for me as an elected official. And I spent a lot of my public, my public platform and my engagement with my voters, trying to save my district from what I thought was a political attack on it, which ended up being true. That was revealed in the tapes, that they were actually undermining my chances for re-election. Let's keep her on the fence. She wants those renters. We're not going to give her those renters. It was a political attack on my district, but I spent a lot of time during that process kind of trying to defend my existing district boundaries because of the way the process was designed, instead of doing what I honestly should have been doing, which is fighting for the interests of Angelenos to be heard, you know? And in my mind, of course, they were one and the same, right? I really thought I was fighting for my constituents' voices to be heard. But I think the process warps the way in which you as an elected official engage with it, right? And it was a flawed process from the get-go, and it warps the way in which you engage with it. Because guess what? I shouldn't be engaging with it at all. That's the reality, right? Sorry, I'm kind of sweating because it's very stressful to think about that time. I think my fears about what I had suspected was happening to my district were happening behind the scenes. And so my fears were justified ultimately, but I still think that, I really left that moment thinking, this is not what elected officials in Los Angeles should be spending their time and energy on. Line drawing is best left to Angelenos. And to people who are really engaging with the numbers, to people who are really engaging with the demographics, and to people who are really engaging with whose voices need to be heard so that we can get the best representation in the city as possible. So I think that was my engagement with it. I put forward a motion, and it was, my office worked with then Council President Paul. Oh, no, sorry. Then he was not Council President, with Paul Krikorian's office to put the motion together. But, I really wanted to introduce it. I was very, very insistent on introducing it. And we actually put it forward almost a year before the tapes leaked. And in a kind of an ironic moment, the item was scheduled on the very last agenda that former Council President Martinez had put together. So it was scheduled to be heard the Wednesday after the tapes leaked. But it took almost a year for it to even be agendized on the council. And it took incredible pushing, because it was a motion that was really designed around reducing elected officials' power and taking away their discretion over their own lines. So, I think I've spoken long enough, and I want to give you an opportunity to ask any follow-ups, or if I'm missing something, to talk about something I'm missing.
No, I just wanted to pull out that what became evident was that I don't know if many Angelenos were aware that we could have gerrymandered districts here in LA, like in a place that's not Ohio, in a place that's not Georgia or North Carolina. We can deal with gerrymanders right here at home in sunny Southern California. And I think that was illuminating to many folks once the tapes did come out. I'm gonna dive into another question for you.
Yeah.
So Councilmember Rahman, when we know that the last redistricting cycle impacted you in a very direct way as an elected official. And we also know that as a council member, you'll be like still giving that up. And so for you and for many of the communities that engaged in the last redistricting cycle, and you witnessed how the current system has completely ignored the communities of interest in the process. How do you see an independent redistricting commission changing things for Angelenos, both in the city and within LAUSD?
I see it helping in three ways. One is just like on a personal basis, as I said, my time, my effort, as an elected official should be spent on serving my constituents, not on serving my incumbency. And I think it will allow us to step away from that. I think we'll probably all watch redistricting happen with a question mark about, okay, how will this impact my next election? How is it going to impact so-and-so's next election? But that's the position that we should have with regards to redistricting, right? Not the kind of the time intensive way in which I feel like LA City elected officials have always dealt with this question. Secondly, I think that, I think for me, I think it will allow us potentially to have a more representative city, and really allow us to be able to draw the lines in ways that ensure that the diversity of the city is reflected in our elected leadership, and that, that kind of every community within our diverse LA population has the capacity to make their voices heard in a fair way in our future maps. And I'm really, really excited about that. I also want to talk about one thing, which I think there are certain things in Los Angeles in the way that it's governed that don't always make total sense to me, right? Even now. So for example, on the issue of land use laws, approving a building is often left to a single council member's discretion as opposed to a set of rules that are kind of similar across the city. And a single council member, if that building or piece of infrastructure or stadium or whatever it is, if it's in their district, they're kind of in charge of negotiating the community benefits from that project and getting it for their district, right? And really, when you think about a piece of infrastructure, when you think about land use should really be set up such that we as elected officials are drawing up the plans, drawing up the rules around land use, but then after that, we kind of leave it to the rules to kind of be implemented, right? Or that the benefits of a particular project or a particular infrastructure investment, like a metro station or a stadium, shouldn't just accrue to one council district. It should really be kind of, how does it impact the surrounding community without an eye towards council district lines? And then how do we make sure that those community benefits are distributed equally? That's not how our land use system works right now. And that's just one of many pieces of how things work in our city that are really divided among council district boundaries that should be actually centralized or more uniform across the city. And so for me, redistricting reform can help that resistance to changing that kind of thing, right? If I'm saying, let's make this, a better system of land use that's citywide, where I'm not making decisions about this property, I'm making decisions about a bigger plan. that's me giving up my power too. But under our current system, I'm incentivized to hold on to that because I want it in my council district. I want it to benefit my council members. I want it to benefit my incumbency. And once you start rethinking redistricting, once you start forgetting about or getting used to the idea that in 1 year that stadium could be in another council district, you still want the benefits of that to get to your residents. How do you design that system? That's a better land use system. So I think for me, it will have knock-on effects on other pieces of governance that don't make sense to me as a council member that I'm really, really excited about.
Yeah.
Sorry,
So
that
it's
was
like-
really,
No, but
yeah.
I gotcha, because I hear you saying this piece of governance reform, nailing down the independent redistricting process, sets us up to have further governance restructuring conversations about how do we really set up a governance structure for Angelenos that is more neutralized, to where we don't have fiefdoms and kingdoms, right? And to where when we're thinking about drawing district boundaries and drawing land use pieces, where we're really thinking about the communities, the people who live in those communities. What do these people need? What are the resources that they need? How do we keep these people whole? Right. And I think that's what I hear you saying.
Yeah, no, at 100%. And by the way, I just want to say the link too between, I know something that you guys really care about, which is campaign finance reform, right?
Yep.
I remember running against someone in my first race who had been an incumbent, who had raised a lot of money from employees at NBC Universal. A lot of money, a ton of money, like tens of thousands of dollars from employees of this one company. Why? Because he had land use authority over that company. You know, so it's all connected. It helps you. If you have these big assets, you get to raise money from them, not just for your constituents, but for your next race. And like, let's think about this in a way that gets us to making decisions that are better for Angelenos rather than better for myself. And I think, like I said, this is exactly like what you said. It's kind of the first step of thinking through a set of governance reforms that ultimately I think will be better for the city. Less corrupt, or less prone to corruption, less prone to boundary-based differentiation, which does not make sense. And just like generally better for the city as a whole.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. I just want to tell you, we sincerely thank you for your time. We know that you're busy. We know that it's late on a weeknight. So thank you for being here. Thank you for sharing your story.
Thank you all. And to all of you who are here learning about redistricting on a Wednesday night at 7 p.m. I mean, I'm so impressed. I'm so impressed.
Thank you. Thank you, council member. I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Godfrey.
All right. Thank you all so much, Russia and Councilmember Rahman. All right, everybody. We have been in the weeds of measures DD and LL. We're even talking about the implications of what happens when we win this particular campaign in November. But now let's just make sure we're the best possible cheerleaders possible for yes on DD and LL, because the average person, as Councilmember Rahman just said, is not going to spend an hour digging into it on a virtual webinar. They're just going to want to know some quick things, and we are going to be the ambassadors for that. So I'm going to ask everybody to start interacting on this call, because at the end of the day, voting is about interaction. We don't do it, nothing happens. So I'm going to ask you to hit up the chat box and get your typing fingers ready to do some interactive cheerleading to get our practice on, so that when our community members ask us what to do on DD and LL, we know what to say to them. All right. So let's pretend community members come up to us and we're like, DD and LL, what do I do with this? Yes or no? Hit up the chat box. What is the right answer here? Yes or no on DD and LL? You're on a call that literally says yes on DD and LL on the screen. So I hope there's a shower of yeses in the chat box. If not, correct your neighbor. We're looking for the yeses on DD and LL. And why? Who should be in charge of redistricting? Should it be politicians or community? Politicians or community? There is a right answer here, and it is community. We want community in charge of its own democracy. And is this independent commission thing even a new idea? Yes or no? No, independent redistricting isn't a made up thing. The state of California already uses it. We're the ones who are behind here in Los Angeles. We want to make sure that we are putting into place a proven, trusted, and nonpartisan system to ensure that our voices, our communities are being centered in all of these conversations. And as we just talked about with Councilmember Rahman, do we want our politicians having closed door communications? Yes or no? Do we want our politicians having closed door communications? Yes or no? The answer is no. Under independent redistricting, when we pass it through DD and LL, if politicians want to say something to community, they got to say it to our face by showing up at public commissions that are the only places where they're going to be able to communicate their thoughts about redistricting at all. But no private communications behind the scene, leading to no incumbency protection, because community is going to make the final decision. And at the end of the day, they're going to prove that by rolling out a final report to us to make sure that every step along the way was actually with us at the center. With that said, I hope that we are all ready to be the best ambassadors possible for DD and LL. So I'm going to pass things to Alessandro to make sure that we know how to help. Alessandro?
Thank you. Thank you, Godfrey. And you just gave everybody a free cheat sheet. So remember, yes on DD, yes on LL, no to indoor communications that are not inclusive and transparent of our communities. And if you think you are without voice, you are definitely not. You have a number of organizations here that you can follow their Instagrams or their social media to learn more about it. But there's also things that you can do as an individual. You can endorse the campaign. You can add, if you're part of an organization, or release your own personal voter guide. You can add measures DD and LL to your voter guide until you get out the vote plan. You can join our campaign, Angelenos for Fair Maps Coalition. You can donate to our campaign. If someone can drop the link, we really appreciate it if you make it rain on us. And you make a Me+3 pledge. If you can go to the next slide so y'all can see an example of some of the organizations and places that have already endorsed. So we have endorsements from Lane, Los Angeles County Democratic Party, the Trans-Latina Coalition, Inner City Struggles, Valley Grassroots. So we're all over LA City. So Angelenos for Fair Maps is all over LA City. So any of these organizations, if you look them up, you can get more information about them, or just hit us up, Angelenos for Fair Maps. I'll send it over back to Russia and Alejandra.
Thank you, Alessandro, for that. And so now everybody has heard, what is redistricting, why it matters, why measures DD and LL matter and are going to make a difference, and how you can get involved. So a lot of information thrown your way. So we want to kind of pause and create space, to answer any questions that you have. What are things that you're still unclear about, other things that you want to really dig in and get answers to. And so if you have a question, please raise your hand on the function below, and then we'll answer questions for, a few minutes here. So I see Tom Bayer with a question. Can you unmute yourself?
Hello.
Hello,
Um,
Tom.
Yeah, I kind of two questions from a state of kind of ignorance, I guess. On the one hand, picking a redistricting commission sounds like a really complicated process where we're supposed to be choosing people who are, not serving ulterior motives or some political gain. That process sounds really difficult to me, how we're going to actually vet people successfully. So maybe that can be addressed by somebody smarter than me. And also I'm imagining, so we have a community-based commission who will then seek input from the public. So I imagine somebody coming to my house and saying, so Tom, what do you think about our upcoming lines and where it should be drawn? It's like, how am I supposed to know? There's so much complicated data that goes into that. I know the most general of all, well, I live in Los Feliz, so Griffith Park affects Los Feliz so much that those two things should be in the same district. But that is so general, and I know the needs of a district line are so much more specific and varied than that. So how would community input really be helpful if it's from the public and not from people with very vested interests, like I'm hoping to build a large building on that block, so I'm hoping I'm going to get that council member who will probably say yes to it. Those are my two big question marks.
Thank you, Tom, and I appreciate those questions. I think in terms of the first question, and definitely want to invite my colleagues here as well to jump in. At least in terms of the first question, one of the things that is being included as part of the measure for Independent Redistricting Commission is the selection, the application and selection process. So criteria has been set up to ensure that folks are not connected in any way with elected officials themselves, their spouse, or immediate family. And so people will have to apply and they will have to submit information and they will have to speak, to how they meet, the eligibility criteria that has been established in this measure. So folks have to be residents of the city of LA, for 5 years, for LAUSD, a resident of LAUSD boundaries for at least 3 years. There's requirements of like being able to be unbiased. There's a lot of other things that are being asked of community as they are applying. And so folks that meet that criteria are going to be moving on to the process. Now, this is going to be a public process. So folks that apply, all applicants, actually their information, who they are, will be public. And so individuals that maybe have knowledge of someone that's like, oh, actually they're connected to this party or they're the lobbyist of this group or whatever, they will be able to report that to the city clerk office and the ethics commission. So we have the city clerk and the ethics commission kind of overseeing the application process. And so we have an opportunity as a public to keep all of those applicants accountable and making sure that they, what they're saying, that they meet the criteria, that actually are meeting it. The second thing in terms of the application and selection process is that even the way that they're going to be selected is not going to be in the hands of anybody to make a judgment call and decide, oh, this person's more eligible than this other person. So there's going to be a two-step process for getting selected on the commission. First step, all of the applicants that met the criteria are going to be divided into subpools by regions. So they're going to be divided into 8 regions. So if you belong to region A, B, C, all the applicants are going to be divided by those regions. So for LA, for the city of LA, for example, we will have 16 commissioners. So the first half, the first 8 commissioners will be selected randomly. So one commissioner will be selected from one of each of the regions. Those 8 are then going to be the ones that will determine the remaining 8 that they need to complete the commission. For that, there's been criteria set up for them to make sure that the makeup of this commission reflects the diversity of LA or of LAUSD. So not only just, about race and gender, but also socioeconomic background. They're going to have to look into other aspects, language, education level, profession, like to make sure that the body as a whole reflects the diversity. And that's going to also have to be a public process where community will be able to really engage with those first 8 commissioners as they are deliberating and figuring out of the remaining applicants who they will be selecting. And so this whole process will be as transparent as possible. And, the hope is that because of the process and the steps, it will lead us to a set of commissioners that are reflective and that are, demonstrating how they meet the criteria. So that's part of that response to that first question. I think the second question in terms of like, well, how can I as a community member be involved and actually say, how can lines be drawn? First off, I just want to recognize that each individual as a resident, as a member of a community, you are an expert because you live in that community. You know your neighbors, you know the areas that folks go and gravitate and hang out with, you know some of the issues that your neighborhood is facing. So you actually, at the start, you know a lot. And so it's really about not the technical pieces of like, how do you draw the lines through where, but rather talking about who makes up the community that you identify with and that you feel connected to. And how do you feel that what other communities share same interest as you and that you should be kept together? Because if you're kept together, you have greater chances of electing folks that represent you and your interest. Or to say, we have this kind of community of interest, but we are very different from this other community. So we shouldn't be together because our interests are opposing, for example. So you are able to really give testimony to commissioners, and you're going to be able to provide that feedback to guide them in their process. So whatever advice, whatever feedback you're able to provide, that's going to be input that commissioners will be using, to draw the lines that best reflect what they're hearing from the diversity of communities, plus the data that they're going to have to get. So long-winded answer. I hope I answered your question. I don't know for others on my team that wanted to add anything else. No? All right. Is there one more question that we can take before we wrap up in the next part of the agenda? Any questions on the chat that came through? All right, but feel free. So, feel free to hit us up with questions as they come up and as you're reading more about the measures. So with that, I wanted to go ahead and close this out. I want to appreciate everybody for being here. And I want to close this out with a call to action. This webinar was the campaign launch, but it doesn't end here. The next step, other than getting folks to support, continue to get endorsements, continue to get the word out, making your plan to get 3 other folks to actually make a plan on how they're going to vote and when they're going to vote. We want to invite you to a rally and press conference that we are holding on Wednesday, October 9th at 9 a.m. We're still determining the location, but we will have that information on our website. But this day commemorates, and I don't know if commemorates the best word, but commemorates when the audio leak came out 2 years ago. And we want to come together and demonstrate that, in response to that, community, elected officials, academics, so many different groups came together asking and demanding reform. And those efforts resulted in these 2 measures. And so we want to be able to celebrate that we are here in this moment and that we are just like a month away, less than a month away, to make this a reality with the election. So we want to invite you all to come out and be part of this press conference. And we put on the chat, I think, the link, if you want to RSVP, I will be there. That way we can have your contact information and we can share the details of the press conference as we get close. So I want to invite you to that and be there with us. Lastly, just want to invite everybody, we have our website, for you all to check out, angelenosforfairmaps.org. We will be continuing to post a lot of information, including this webinar, the PowerPoint slides, so that you can share it with others. And, feel free to hit us up, at our email info@angelenosforfairmaps.org. If you have any other questions, need more resources or information, we are here. And we want to be doing this all together, so we have an opportunity. It's been 100 years since this system of redistricting has changed, ever 100 years. So let's celebrate, these 100 years with making sure measures DD and LL pass and win in November. So with that, I want to thank you all for being here. Thank you to Councilmember Nithya Raman for participating and everybody here. And please help us get the word out and make sure you vote yes on measures DD and LL. Have a great night, everybody. Thank you.